Welcome to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Sales and Marketing Institute. We're thrilled to have you with us, regardless of what your company does in the data center, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities ecosystem. Perhaps you're part of a data center operator like a hyperscaler or co-location provider, edge, modular, or wholesale data center provider, developer. Perhaps you're part of a technology or facilities related company or construction, real estate company or investor, or perhaps you work for a company in and around outsourced marketing and sales for data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. That's at the company level, but what do you do individually? What kinds of people get the most value from the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show? Perhaps you work in some kind of sales related role, like as an account executive or sales development or business development rep or account manager, or perhaps you're on the product side or channel partnerships or marketing, or maybe you're the executive sponsor, the leader, the one who's responsible for recruiting the right talent into the right roles, providing all the support that's necessary for individuals, teams, and the company as a whole to achieve its goals in this tremendous period of growth that we are in. If you want to stay in the loop on upcoming educational resources and educational events just like this, make sure that you subscribe to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes directly to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe for free directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for today? We're going to first start by talking about how a data center operations and sustainability consulting firm can personalize its strategic insights. Then we'll talk about how a data center power consultancy can grow its client base. After that, we'll turn our attention to infrastructure, and in particular, how a data center infrastructure provider can generate leads, establish trust, and educate customers. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how a global data center power management business can gain country traction. Then how a data center design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management business grows. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how wholesale data centers can manage the lengthy sales cycle. If you have an idea for a topic or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform you're watching. And for sure, let us know what you do in the data center industry. So without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question. What do we got? How does a data center operations and sustainability consulting firm personalize its strategic insights? So your company is in professional services, providing consulting services, focusing on data center operations and data center sustainability. And you've decided that you're going to use strategic insights as a big part of your growth engine. So in order to personalize those strategic insights so they're as valuable as possible to the most important audiences for your operations and sustainability services, we need to get really dialed into who your ideal clients are. And usually we can figure that out externally by looking at your website. Maybe there's testimonials or logos or case studies. And if it's not listed there, you for sure can go into your CRM, your customer relationship management system. You can talk with your company leadership. You can talk with your finance leader and try to figure out where most of the revenue is coming from. Which are the most profitable clients, who stays the longest, who has the best unit economics, which are the happiest, which tend to land and expand, which are the best clients, realizing that your answer on what you consider best could be different than another company, but where have you done best in the past? That's how we're going to make sure that we have a really tight ideal client profile so we know where these clients are located. Are you able to provide data center operations consulting and sustainability consulting globally Do you focus on one region of the world? Do you focus on a continent? Do you focus on a couple of countries, a single country? Where are you primed to do your best work, in which locations geographically? So that's part of your ideal client profile. Another big area that a lot of people don't give enough thought to is how big or how small your ideal clients are. In other words, you know what your entry level program looks like for operations consulting and sustainability consulting. And you also know what some of your larger, more enterprisey kind of clients look like. So with all that in mind, what is the range of company sizes that would be the best fit for your services? Like, what's big enough to be able to afford your minimum level of engagement, and what's so large that they overwhelm your company's current capabilities and just wouldn't be a great fit today? Now, of course, in the data center industry, people love to talk about the size of the facility. They love to talk about how much power is coming into the facility. But when it comes to basic prospecting, basic strategy, figuring out what strategic insights are most valuable, I'd encourage you to normalize that part of your ideal client profile based on number of employees, number of headcounts. So for a lot of companies that would provide operations consulting and sustainability consulting in various parts of the world and in various regions, maybe your minimum client size is 50 employees, or maybe it's 200 employees, up to as much as 5,000 employees or something like that. And again, your answer is going to vary quite a bit depending on where you've achieved product market fit and go to market fit and channel partner market fit if you have an indirect part of your strategy, overall strategy. But at the end of the day, we need to get really clear on where they're located and how big or small their companies are. In some cases too, you may also want to narrow down the kinds of industries or business models that are an especially good fit for your operations and sustainability consulting. Like, for example, does your team tend to do especially well with manufacturing and technology, but struggles a lot with healthcare and education? Again, this is going to vary tremendously depending on your roster of talent, your unique expertise, your resources, your capital, your location. But if you know data about where you're especially successful and where you struggle, that should also be in your ideal client profile. Because, for example, the industries of the business models that are a great fit, I'll tell you for sure, each of those deserves a page on your website. Each of those deserves some real estate on your website navigation. They probably should all have their own lead generation offers, their own lead nurturing, perhaps their own events. And even the ones that are a bad fit, you should be aware of as well. Not because you're going to give them real estate on the website, but when it comes to like inclusions and exclusions in outbound prospecting, inclusions and exclusions in ads targeting, drop-down lists on your web forms for lead generation forms, filtering and segmentation strategies in your CRM for what's qualified versus not qualified can be really helpful to know. You know, if in this particular example, you do well with manufacturing and telecommunications, but you struggle with government and education or something like that, or healthcare and education. So to personalize these strategic insights, once you know at the company level who you're going after, we need to understand who are the individuals within these companies that matter most. Is it vice president of operations? Is it director of sustainability? Again, the leveling and the titles are going to vary quite a bit depending on their company size. We know, other things being equal, that's in smaller companies, people tend to wear a lot of hats, right? They do lots of different jobs. In larger companies, it tends to be a lot more segmented out. There tends to be a lot more fine tuning, a lot more people across a lot of different roles and perhaps different departments. So depending on your company size, depending on their company size, in how you define your ideal client profile, that has a lot to do with how granular or how coarse your segmentation strategy is, your buyer personas. But say for argument's sake, we're selling to an ESG, environmental sustainability governance person, and we're selling to a data center operations leader. So one's your primary buyer persona, one's your secondary buyer persona. One has the most impact, economic impact on the relationship with your company. The other one has the second most impact. And what we need to know for each of those roles is what their biggest goals are and what their biggest challenges are. What is in their job description? What's in their objectives and key results that they're trying to achieve individually, as a company, as a team? And we need those goals in their own words, not what you think their goals are, probably are, but what their words actually are. In other words, we need to talk to them. We need to ask them these questions. We need to do the research and find the consensus for the top 5 or 6 biggest goals that they're working on. The flip side of that is we also need to know the 5 or 6 biggest challenges, their biggest struggles, what's driving them nuts, what's stressing them out to no end. And again, we need those in their own words. So we want to repeat this exercise for each of your most important buyer personas, like in this particular case, an operations leader and a sustainability leader. So we figure out their 5 or 6 biggest goals, their 5 or 6 biggest challenges for each of these 2 segments. That's going to help us prioritize what's going on in their world. It's going to help us have a lot more empathy for what is happening right now that we could potentially help them with, both from a services roadmap perspective, but even throughout the full journey, long before they know that they even need your services. Because in a world now where so much of the journey happens without you in the room, it is incredibly important for us to figure out how to get you in there early and often. So many companies make the mistake of only showing up at the end. But the problem is when you only show up at the end, all the preferences are formed already. They've already figured out how they're going to address this. And if you're only popping up when they're in the final 17% of that journey, when they're just about ready to purchase, the only thing that's going to sway their conversation, that's going to sway their decision in many cases, is cheaper. And we know that you don't want to be in the business of chasing to the bottom, the race to the bottom. So in order for you to be able to differentiate and educate and build trust, it's incredibly important that you have significant presence in most or all of the awareness and the consideration stages, when you have a chance to educate and build trust with multiple stakeholders on these teams. So not only are you getting to the decision maker, assuming there actually is one person that's actually a decision maker, but more importantly, you're getting to the decision committee by using educational resources and educational events that are specific to each kind of stakeholder, for each kind of buyer persona. So when it comes to personalizing your strategic insights, what's most important is to be crystal clear at the account level, at the company level, who these ideal clients are. That's going to give you what you need to build out your target account list that fuels all your account-based marketing, your ABM, your account-based selling. And then within those accounts, figuring out, based on, as long as you have a viable business where you've already achieved product market fit and go to market fit, what kinds of stakeholders are most often involved pre-sales and post-sales? What's going on in their world? What do they care most about? And how can you better support those prioritized buyer personas throughout their full buyer's journey to get in there early and often, the right people, the right places, the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so they see your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center operations and data center sustainability. And the tricky part with all of this is, in many cases, we need to figure out what is the leading indicator that someone is going to be in market for your services in the coming days, in the coming weeks, and in the coming months. Because if we just focus on those 2 kinds of services that you articulated, there's an excellent chance that we're going to miss them, or at least we're not going to get in there early enough to be able to make an impact. When we're able to get in early enough to make an impact, not only do we get your company on the short list, and by showing up repeatedly, by having lots of educational events, lots of educational resources where they're constantly learning new insights to help them do their jobs better, you're driving alignment across multiple stakeholders from that team. That's the key part with all of this too, that a lot of people overlook, is that when you're successful of understanding what's truly going on in these individual accounts, and you're providing incredibly helpful professional development, learning and development for these kinds of stakeholders, they're going to be a lot more motivated to want to bring their peers, their coworkers, even their boss along with them. Teams that learn together, grow together, when you can proactively solve alignment challenges when they're still in the awareness and the consideration stages of the journey, that really stacks the decks tremendously in your company's favor, because you have an audience that's receptive to learning your best practices, to learning your methodologies. So by the time they are ready for that sales conversation, for the most part, when you've done this well, they're already indoctrinated on your ways and your unique perspective on anything and everything having to do with data center operations and sustainability. So it's not only a matter of understanding who they are, but it's also it's critical to understand where they are and to make sure that you have resources that support these most important kind of stakeholders throughout their awareness, throughout their consideration, and throughout their decision-making process. Right? Remember, we now live in a world where 83% of researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room. That's Gartner's latest research. So what's most important is we figure out a way to get you back into that room, because we can't go back in time. It's not like there's a flux capacitor and DeLorean that's going to solve this whole thing. But the next best thing that we can do is to motivate the most important stakeholders to want to spend significant amounts of professional development and learning development time with your internal and external subject matter experts that help those folks level up on what they need to do to solve their individual challenges that they're struggling with individually, that their team is struggling with, that their company is struggling with, and close the gaps on achieving the goals, both as individuals, as a team, and as a company. So that's how a data center operations and sustainability consulting firm can personalize its strategic insights. Okay, what do we got up next? By the way, if you're getting good value so far from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you help spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching on or listening on. So next question is, how does a data center power consultancy grow its client base? So how does a consulting services company that specializes in data center power grow its client base? So just to orient where we are, a data center power consultancy exists within the facilities part of the data center ecosystem. So like your first cousins and adjacent businesses, the obvious ones would be like data center energy and data center cooling, but data center facilities also includes like commissioning, decommissioning, physical security, maintenance, cleaning, anything that has to do with the facility itself. So you're within that data center facilities segment. You're not a technology company. You're not a data center operator, although it's very likely that you sell to data center operators as well as enterprises with their own data centers. You're not in the construction, real estate, or investment part of the data center ecosystem, but depending on how early you get involved in the life cycle of a brand new data center, it would actually behoove you to build some relationships with data center developers, data center contractors, and perhaps even some data center investors and data center site planners on the data center design side, on the data center architecture side. So to grow your client base as a data center power consultancy, a lot of it comes down to understanding where you've done best in the past. Do you tend to do well with small to mid-sized co-location operators? Do you have deep expertise in working with huge hyperscale facilities? Do you have unique expertise that's incredibly valuable for edge facilities? Are you not so good with data center operators, but you're fantastic when it comes to enterprise data centers? And if you tell me all of the above, we can do all of this, I would challenge you to be more self-aware of your company's capacity and limitations, and whether you're really fantastic at all of those, or whether you're just fantastic at one or two of those segments and like so at some of the others. So get really specific on who these ideal clients are, what their business model is, where they're located, because when it comes to power, this isn't something we're going to deliver long distance or virtually. More than likely, you're going to be going on site quite often, at least during the initial build out and some ongoing installation, maintenance, commissioning, all that stuff, for meeting the power needs initially on an ongoing basis. So with that in mind, geographically, where are these ideal clients located? Are they big companies? Are they small companies? Are they medium-sized companies? To get specific on the headcount, more than likely, because you focus on power, you're wired to first think about the kilowatts and the megawatts and perhaps even the gigawatts at the stage where we are, right? So you may be thinking first and foremost about that, but when it comes to prospecting and lead generation and marketing and sales, at some point, you're going to want to normalize from the power capacity of that site, square footage, square meters of that site, to employees, number of employees, number headcount for that particular company. And then there may be certain verticals or industries where you do better than others. With that ideal client profile defined, you should be able to build your target account list. Usually it's a couple dozen. In some cases, it may be a few hundred. In some rare cases, it may be a few thousand if you're selling nationally to multiple geographic markets. These are the accounts, these are the companies that you would love to have as a client in the future that fit really, really well with your ideal client profile. Then within those accounts, we need to figure out who are the people that matter most when it comes to being able to sell power consulting services. And again, the answer of how granular versus how broad these segments, who these buyer personas are, will depend a lot on how big or small your company is and how big or small their company is, especially how big or small their company is. Because, for example, if you're really good at selling power consulting services to independently owned co-location businesses with 1 or 2 locations, at that size, you're almost certainly going to need to have a relationship with the CEO, CTO, owner, or whatever you want to call it, because at that size, there's usually a few dozen employees, and you're going nowhere fast on that kind of engagement if you're not engaging at the highest level. And that company, even if eventually there's a handful of other people with their direct reports and everything that will filter into that relationship at some point. The flip side of that is if you're selling to a global data center operator, like a publicly traded real estate investment trust or something like that, again, depending on the scope of your engagement, you could be dealing with C-level executives, but more than likely it's probably something that's happening at like a director level or vice president level or something like that. And again, you'll know what the appropriate level is in the company based on size, pattern, recognition that you've had for engaging with similar kinds of clients like this in the past. Sometimes there's great clues about this already sitting in your website, on your case studies, your testimonials, your review, your logos. In other cases, there's clues about what's the best fit by looking in your CRM system or however else you're keeping track of your client's communications and unit economics and revenue and things like that. So to grow your client base, we need to know what kinds of companies, and then we need to know the stakeholders within those companies. Now, the stakeholders, again, are going to vary depending on their size. You could actually, depending on the size of client you're selling into, there could actually be people that just specialize in power and energy. More than likely in most companies, this falls within facilities management, this falls within engineering. There's MEP people. There's a lot of different ways that companies address the hiring and the job titles and how they split up these kinds of responsibilities. But at the end of the day, we're looking for where you've been most successful. Now, how other companies that may be significantly bigger or smaller than yours, or targeting significantly bigger or smaller clients than you, but where you have actually been successful. If you're a brand new company, usually where those initial hunches, those initial hypotheses come from when you're targeting is you as a founder or your founding team more than likely has some experience in this space. So where do you have this experience? Where do you have unique advantages that position your company especially well? And that's usually where you'll start from with your initial business development efforts to grow your client base. So we need to know at a company level who we're trying to target, and we need to know the individuals within those companies that care the most about data center power. And then the game is we need to figure out a way to get on their radar screen as early as possible and as often as possible. And we don't want to be seen as a vendor. We really want to be seen as an expert. We want to be seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center power for companies in this particular geographic region that are roughly this size, perhaps in these industries, and for this kind of stakeholder within this kind of company. And the more hyper-specific your expertise, your knowledge is, your best practices are, the more incredibly valuable it is to the recipient. And that's the unlock with all of this in a self-driven buyer's journey, where most of the researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing now happens without you in the room. People are more sales allergic than ever. So in order to combat that sales allergy, we need to figure out a way for your client-facing team members to no longer just be seen as vendors, to get out of the vendor box and stay out of the vendor box once and for all. And the way that you're typically going to want to approach this is the folks on your business development team, your BDRs, your SDRs, your account executives, your account managers, your marketers. They need to look a lot more like teachers and consultants and subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and a lot less by their traditional job titles. In other words, for the people in these companies that care the most about data center power, instead of showing up as someone that's looking to do lead generation on them or to get them onto your deals board or something like that, we need to create an environment where these folks want to spend time with client-facing members of your team because they see those folks as part of their professional development, as part of their learning and development. So in other words, when you can insert yourself into the upskilling, the reskilling, the keeping up process with the most important stakeholders in these companies that care about data center power, magical things start to happen. One is it's a lot more likely that these individuals are motivated to introduce you to their coworkers, to introduce you to their boss. So when it comes to like, whether it's downloading an ebook, watching an on-demand webinar, attending a breakfast seminar, or lunch and learn, or something like that, when it's pure educational value that's hyper relevant for who they are, their biggest goals, their biggest struggles, it's far more likely that when you send the confirmation email to say, it's so great to see that you registered, but we know when it comes to data center power, it truly takes a village. And most co-location companies or hyperscale companies like yours, there's typically people from these 3, 4, 5 different roles. So with that in mind, who else should attend? Simply hit the forward button, add a thought or two on why this matters, and we look forward to helping your company achieve its data center power goals and overcome its biggest data center power challenges. And you'd be shocked at when you're providing value proactively and it's hyper relevant for who they are, how motivated and interested they are in being the hero with the rest of their team. And remember, it's relatively low risk at this point on their part. They're not recommending that their peers make a purchase decision from you. All they're doing is saying, hey, I found this really cool resource. We should watch it. We should read it. We should attend this. And you'll know this is starting to work because you see multiple people from the same company registering and most of those folks attending. And you get fantastic feedback. And when you hold part 2 and part 3, you didn't think this was going to be one and done, right? When you hold successive parts of that monthly series that hits goal number 4, goal number 5, challenge number 2, challenge number 3, we identified probably 10 or 12 topics that are incredibly top of mind for this kind of segment. When we invite them to these sequels, we start to notice from the same company that there's increasingly more and more people, teams that learn together, grow together. And what you're proactively doing is you're driving alignment and building consensus in the awareness and the consideration stages where they're formative months, they're formative days, they're formative weeks, where you have a chance to be able to dramatically impact the criteria that they're going to use to evaluate all of the options that are in front of them for how they address their biggest data center power related goals and power related challenges. So education is the new way to get the foot in the door. If you have internal subject matter experts that can be speakers in this context, great. If you don't have internal subject matter experts, maybe you have vendors or channel partners that can be guest speakers. That's also fine. Again, we want to deliver a ton of value. And when we can get people to come to your facility to experience this educational content, so much the better. If we can't, record it, make it available on demand for their peers, their coworkers that were unable to attend. If it's not practical for them to attend because they're not located within like a 30 or 60-minute drive of your location, you could do a road show, take this on the road for the top 10 locations where they're located, hit a different one every month. Or you can also run these as webinars. A lot of the same content that you would deliver in person that talks about data center power issues, you could also run as webinars and live streams, both live and on demand, and you can repurpose that dozens of different ways for all the different ways that people prefer to consume this content. But at the end of the day, we need to deliver value that motivates these prospects and clients to want to spend a significant amount of time with your client-facing team members in a learning and development in a professional development context. So that is how a data center power consultancy can grow its client base with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so they see your team members as the be-all end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center power. Okay, what do we got up next? How does a data center infrastructure provider generate leads, establish trust, and educate customers? How does a data center infrastructure provider generate leads, establish trust, and educate customers? That is a terrific question. And the first thing that we need to establish is which kind of infrastructure are you providing? This is an interesting thing that comes up from time to time in much the same ways, in much the same way that you can be doing data center consulting in multiple parts of the data center ecosystem. There's actually two quite different meanings for data center infrastructure. For a data center technology related company or technology services related company, infrastructure has to do with telecommunications, cabling, connectivity, digital infrastructure. For a data center facilities related company, you're probably talking a lot about like water utilities, electric utilities, road infrastructure, physical grading of the GRAD of the soil and like site selection and stuff like that. So yeah, infrastructure can have very different meanings depending on whether you're anchored to the technologies part of data centers or the facilities part of data centers. And of course, if you're anchored to both of them, you'll have multiple, it'll take a multidisciplinary team on your part to be able to deliver those kinds of services. So for a data center infrastructure provider, regardless of whether you're providing technology infrastructure or facilities related infrastructure or both, to generate leads, establish trust, and educate customers, we need to get really dialed into who these ideal customers are. Do we know, like, for example, where they're located? That's a big deal because infrastructure in most contexts, like we're talking about here, requires physical presence. Doesn't always have to, but in most cases, in and around, whether it's data center operators or end users or technology or facilities, most of the time you or a channel partner or someone else you work with will need to have some geographic proximity to be able to have some physical presence, both pre and post installation. Second, we need to know how big or small your average clients are. Are you just as capable of delivering data center infrastructure to tiny companies like a 10-person company, a 20-person, 50-person company, or something like that, as a 50,000 or 100,000 employee Fortune 500 kind of company? Or do you have a different kind of sweet spot? And again, in order to figure out like what locations you're well suited to serve, as well as the company sizes, it's a lot of looking at where you've done best in the past. Like, what are the patterns that show up? What are the commonalities that show up when we look at your client list, when we look at your case studies, when we look at your logos? Because in order to generate the right kinds of leads and qualify them properly and decide who we're going to educate and build trust with, we need to get really dialed into where they're located and how big or how small their companies are. In a lot of cases as well, when it comes to educating and building trust and lead generation, we also need to think about what business models, what niches, what industries that we've historically done better at than others. Because in a very noisy world where there's a lot of competition for people's attention, the more hyper-specific your educational resources are, the more hyper-specific your website, email marketing, social media content, your events are, the easier it is to stand out in a crowded space. So let's get really specific about where they're located, how big or small their companies are, and what industries they tend to be in. The industries also can be a driver of like setting up a separate page for each on your website, having some real estate on your homepage, having some real estate in your website navigation. Certainly each of these most important industries or segments, in many cases, deserves their own lead generation and lead nurturing funnels, deserves their own event strategy for educating and building trust. Because for sure, when you look at different kinds of industries, when you look at different kinds of stakeholders, even within the same kinds of industries, you can see big differences in the goals and the challenges that they're trying to achieve that are directly or indirectly related to data center infrastructure. So we know where they're located, their company size, their industry. That will help you build out your target account list. But then we need to figure out who the individuals are within these companies that matter most, that care the most about data center infrastructure, and that are aligned well with the stakeholders that typically would engage your company for a significant considered purchase of data center infrastructure related products and services. So once we have those, we need to understand their biggest goals and challenges, and that goes into building everything that you're doing with how you communicate and educate and build trust with these clients. In other words, like if you've built your website, if you've built email marketing, if you've built social media posts, if you've built your event strategy, and you're not crystal clear on the who and the why, it's time to go back to it, and you're not resonating, you're not getting the kind of responses that you want. It's time to go back to the drawing board and get a lot more dialed into who these individuals are, how we're prioritizing them. The most important segment we call your primary buyer persona. The second most important segment we might call your secondary buyer persona. Maybe there's a tertiary buyer persona that's important, but not as important as the other two. There may be micro personas, sub personas, negative personas. It's incredibly important that we understand who these stakeholders are, and even more important than that, and rank them. And even more important than that, what's going on in their world that we could potentially help them with. And not just what's going on in their world at the point of purchase decision, but what's going on in the weeks and the months leading up to purchase decision. Because in a self-driven buyer's journey, where people really don't want to spend a lot of time with salespeople anymore, it's incredibly important that we figure out how to earn our way back in the awareness and the consideration stage. And in most cases, that's with having incredibly high levels of empathy about what they're struggling with and what they're trying to figure out how to do, and showing up with educational resources and educational events that help better support what they're trying to accomplish individually, as a team, as a company, when it comes to anything and everything that's related to data center infrastructure. So that should drive your lead generation strategy, whether you're talking about downloadable premium content, whether you're talking about registering for online events, whether you're talking about registering for offline events, or all of the above. And in terms of establishing trust and educating customers, most of what you're doing going forward when it comes to content creation and events should be focused on educating and building trust. I think for a lot of companies in the data center ecosystem that invest very aggressively in going to and exhibiting and sponsoring data center conferences, they're confused, or at least when I look at where the majority of their investments are going, they're confused about how much the world has changed, because their booth on the expo floor is largely meant for people that are at the decision stage, in the final 17% of that buyer's journey. And the booth largely ignores the much, much, much wider part of the funnel, of the much wider part of the addressable market that's not yet ready for a sales conversation, that's in that first 83%. At conferences, the keynotes and the breakout sessions, when they're done well, should be doing a really good job with topics that are in that awareness and the consideration stage. So what that means is, if you have a significant presence at a conference, the primary way that you would educate and build trust is by getting a organic speaking slot where you're earned your way onto the agenda, and you're talking about, you're educating and building trust with that particular audience based on best practices and tips and strategies that can help those individuals do their job better, that are aligned with those buyer personas, goals, and challenges. The struggle with that for a lot of companies is they are treading water almost immediately, because when they're deciding what conferences to invest in attending or speaking at, or inevitably just having a presence, you really should be looking very carefully at their demographics in last year's media kit and this year's forecasted media kit, and see how well your ideal client profile aligns with their stated demographics. Now, most conferences aren't getting these demographics audited, so it's really just a good faith effort. But if their good faith representation of who they expect to be there doesn't line up really well with your ideal client profile, you may have a much bigger loss factor than you realize. In other words, there may be a significant percentage, perhaps even the majority of the people at that conference that don't align with your ideal client profile. So it's really important to make sure that you get that part right. And it's also important to be crystal clear that the booths are essentially decision stage for people in that final 17%. And the speaking spots are for the majority of people that are in that awareness and consideration phase in the first 83% of the journey. So what that means is, if you're attending a conference or you're exhibiting at a conference and you're not the one on stage that's doing the education and trust building, The question is, what are you doing there? Booking lots of meetings. Okay, I hope you're booking meetings with the right people and the right kind of context, and that they see you as experts. But the reality is, for a lot of companies, you should be in. If you want to do this right, if you want to be able to educate and build trust with the right people in the right places at the right time and in the right context, and you want to be laser focused on your ideal clients and your target buyer personas, you will almost certainly have a much easier time doing this hosting your own events in person and virtually, and supplementing some of that with other people's events. When the majority of the budget is going to other people's events and you're starving away resources from producing and hosting your own events, you're making it very, very difficult for yourself unless your product has extremely, extremely broad appeal. Now, it's possible it does, and it's possible you have a Fortune 50, Fortune 500 kind of brand, and you have a lot of at-bats because of that. But if you're a smaller, more resource-constrained company, and you have a very, very granular, finely tuned target audience, ideal client profile, where you're looking to educate and build trust with those customers and generate the right kinds of leads, there's a lot to be said for laser focused and operating surgically, as opposed to throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall and seeing what potentially sticks. Because we now live in a world where people have access to tons of information for learning things on their own, tons of access to be able to network online. And I want you to spend your resources in the right place when it comes to generating leads and educating customers and establishing trust. So regardless of whether you provide infrastructure on the facility side, infrastructure on the technology side, or perhaps you're really, really versatile and you're operating in both the technology and the facility side of data center infrastructure, at the end of the day, if you're trying to generate leads and establish trust and educate customers, to stack the decks in your company's favor, get really dialed into who your ideal client is at the company level, who these couple hundred companies are, or maybe it's less, maybe it's a couple dozen companies, or perhaps in some cases it's a couple thousand, but that defined list of companies that matter most. And in those companies, who are the stakeholders that matter most? And think about how you can put yourself in a position where most of your interactions with the right people are in the context of seeing your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center infrastructure, not just a vendor that's focused on getting their company on your deal board or opening opportunity, but putting yourself in a position constantly where one or more of your client-facing team members are seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center infrastructure for a company in this specific geographic region of roughly this company size in this kind of industry, and for this very specific kind of stakeholder that's incredibly important to your pre and post sales engagement. That's how you prioritize and back into your prioritized your primary and your secondary buyer persona, and making sure that you're just delivering outrageously high levels of value to them throughout their full buyer's journey, not just at the end, but the full 100% of the buyer's journey. So you earn your way in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So that's how I would approach how a data center infrastructure provider can generate leads, establish trust, and educate customers. We're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back, we'll dive into 3 more of the biggest challenges facing companies in data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. If you're getting great value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button and help spread the word.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're watching this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should be addressing in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you like to watch. So what do we have up next? How does a global data center power management business gain country traction? Whoa, that's a really interesting one. How does a data center power management company gain country traction, traction within a specific company, within a specific country, rather specific country, specific nation? So how do we do this with geo targeting? I think the first thing that we should do is go back and review your ideal client profile and make sure you're really clear on what that country is. And is it the entire country, or is it a specific part of the country where you are primed to provide your power management solution? So get really dialed into that. And of course, their size, if there's certain industries that are better fit than others. But when it comes to getting country specific traction, there's a couple of different playbooks that I'd recommend. For starters, when it comes to your digital, I would lean a lot more heavily on outbound prospecting and ads than just organic. The reason being is that when it comes to your outbound prospecting, whether it's by email, by LinkedIn, by, in some cases, phone, it's probably email and LinkedIn at this point, you can be hyper specific about knowing where these folks are located and how big or small their companies are. Whereas by just posting organically on LinkedIn, for example, you're at the mercy of the algorithm for whether the majority of your first degree connections or their network even see that beyond that. But second, like, you just don't have that kind of precision. In the same way, ads are also very, very effective, more expensive, but also very, very effective of giving you country specific precision. So let's say, for example, you're running sponsored posts, or you're running conversational, or you're running thought leadership ads, whatever it is, you can specifically say, hey, I only want these to show in this particular country. And every once in a while, there'll be some edge cases that slip in because of VPNs or people artificially messing around with their location or traveling or something like that. But for the most part, when you're doing outbound the right way, when you're doing ads the right way, that precision pretty well holds up. If we were having this conversation a couple of years ago, I would also talk about the difference between organic search and paid search. And it's still relevant to a certain degree. You actually can still buy Google ads, at least for the time being. And there's still some value in doing so. But with the rise of ChatGPT and Copilot and Perplexity and Claude and Gemini over the last couple of years, we know the traditional search engine results page is getting very, very disrupted very quickly. But again, the advantage with paid search, SEM, search engine marketing, compared to SEO, search engine optimization, is with paid search, you can say, look, when it comes to people searching for data center power management, I only want people to see this ad in this particular country. And all other countries, no, don't spend my ad budget there. And again, there'd be VPNs, there'd be people traveling and things like that. So it wouldn't be perfect, but it would generally be pretty good with all of that. So again, there's a big difference between depending on free, which we really know isn't free because of all the work that goes into it. But when it comes to like free traffic or free posting or organic versus paid allows you to be a lot more precise. Even the same thing with YouTube. Like if you're building great YouTube videos on data center power management, sure, you could just put those there and you'll get a global audience and you'll get a lot of people from a lot of different countries. But if you want just one specific country, the way you're typically going to achieve that is by running ads, YouTube ads, which runs through the same Google Ads platform. Of course, Google and YouTube are both owned by Alphabet. So to get that country specific traction, that's on the digital side, using a combination of like outbound prospecting and I'd say at this point, predominantly LinkedIn ads. If you have an enterprise marketing budget, there's third-party options that reach a lot more people than just LinkedIn ads. But if this is your first foray into doing this, if you did nothing more than using like Sales Navigator and outbound email and LinkedIn Campaign Manager, you'd be in great shape for getting some basic country traction. The second part of that is beyond the digital. It's like, okay, so what is the offer that you're driving people to? You could drive them to premium content to download, like a report, a planning guide, a template guide, or ebook or something like that. I'm a lot more partial to getting the right kind of personas to spend time with you in an educational events context. And that educational event could be webinars, it could be live streams, it could be in person. if you have the luxury in this country traction that you're trying to build of knowing that most of your target audience, most of your buyer personas are within a relatively straightforward 30 or 60-minute drive of your location, what I'd love to see you do is start hosting educational events at your company's facility on a very, very regular basis. And those educational events should be dialed into not a commercial for your data center power management. They should be, that can be a small part of that, but what the majority of what that educational event strategy should be focusing on is the biggest goals and the biggest challenges of your most important prioritized buyer personas. So when you figure out who the most important stakeholder is and who the second most important stakeholder is that you engage with on a regular basis when it comes to data center power management, do your homework and figure out what their 5 or 6 biggest goals are, what their 5 or 6 biggest challenges are. And then you take those 10 or 12 topics, the 5 or 6 biggest goals, 5 or 6 biggest challenges, and those 10 or 12 topics become 10 or 12 events that you host once a month over the next 10 or 12 months. Again, if they can attend in person, their breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, or something like that in your conference room, in your classroom, in your foyer, wherever you can hold these cost effectively. Again, you don't need large numbers for this to be wildly successful. If your classroom or conference room holds 20 people and you're filling that up most of the time with 20 people that are the right people from your target accounts, wow, can amazing things happen with lead generation and building pipeline when they keep coming back month after month to keep learning from your internal subject matter experts. And of course, when you're building this from a tactical perspective, let's say it's an event that you're hosting from 8:30 in the morning till 10 o'clock in the morning. So they arrive, they check in, they have a little bit of breakfast, a little bit of time to chat with each other. Your subject matter expert, your panel, whatever you're doing, puts on the formal educational part of the program for 30 or 40 minutes. They take 10 or 15, 20 minutes of Q&A, and then you can either give them a tour around your facility or showroom, you give them a demo, or something that's a little more salesy, a little more self-promotion. But first, provide value, outrageously high levels of value. So much so that if they flew across the country, they flew across the world to go to a conference and yours was one of the breakout sessions they attended, that you're highly confident that you're going to get a fantastic grade on your report card, that you're going to get great feedback on those evaluations. That's how good that content needs to be. And of course, record it for the people that are the coworkers or that weren't able to attend, that want to be able to watch it later on demand. And if you don't have the luxury of your primary and your secondary buyer personas in this particular country being able to get to your facility within a reasonable 30 or 60-minute drive, then you host the exact same events on webinars with the same subject matter experts. It's a little harder to send the bagel and the coffee through the webinar software, but it's the same basic idea, using events, educational events, to educate and build trust with your prioritized buyer personas. And I would do this one segment at a time. Like, let's say, for example, for data center power management, that there's a facilities part of this, there's an infrastructure part of this, there's an engineering part of this, there's maybe 3 different segments. Don't try to come up with one size fits most. If that's the only possible way to do it, it's certainly better to do that than not do this at all. But if you really want to resonate, if you really want to provide extreme value and stand out from the crowd, separate event series for your prioritized buyer personas. In other words, once you understand the goals and the challenges of the facilities managers compared to the engineers, compared to the infrastructure folks, or whoever else are the 2 or 3 most important segments, give each of those their own series. In the same way you'd give each of those their own page on your website and their own lead generation offers, and probably their own sales team. It's very likely at this point that you start to specialize by segment or specialize by buyer persona. So when it comes to getting country-specific traction, in-person events, virtual events are a big part of that. And I would also look for where you can take your educational content on the road within that country where other people have access to that same audience. As long as you've done your homework and you've determined that most of their attendees line up with your ideal client profile, it's actually a really good idea to take 1 or 2 of those 12 topics that you do and figure out a way to deliver that in a 20-minute format, in a 60-minute format, in a half-day format, whatever it is, and then look for other kinds of organizations in that particular region, membership-based organizations, user groups, what have you, where they would allow your subject matter expert to come in and be the featured speaker for that particular event. Again, there's nothing wrong with buying a booth at a small, highly targeted event like that if the cost is reasonable and there's a really strong ideal client profile match with their anticipated demographics. But what I'd prefer any day of the week is to have your subject matter expert be the featured speaker that's doing all the education and the trust building, as opposed to someone that's just trading t-shirts for business cards. There's nothing wrong with trading t-shirts for business cards if it's a perfect fit. But I'd much rather your efforts go into building your professional brand around expertise and getting out of the vendor box and staying out of the vendor box as much as possible. So that's how I would advise a global data center provider power management company gaining country-specific traction, is to get really tight on what that country is, figure out how you're going to create awareness, typically using outbound prospecting and using ads, and figure out what your offer is. I'm very partial to awareness and consideration building in the early and the middle stages of the journey that are focusing on educating and building trust around their biggest goals and their biggest challenges that intersect with one or more of really smart people on your team, your internal subject matter experts, when it comes to being able to be part of those personas, professional development and learning development. In other words, you're teaching them all the best practices on how they can improve their career, improve what they're achieving, what their team is achieving, what their company is achieving, and sharing really important industry best practices with them as well. So that is how a global data center power management business can gain country-specific traction. Okay, what do we have up next? How does a data center design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management business grow? How does a data center design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management business grow? So this is an interesting business in that it spans more than one part of the data center ecosystem. So design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure. So you're not a data center operator, you're not a data center technology company, but the design part falls within construction, real estate, and investment. And energy monitoring falls within facilities. Infrastructure management could also fall within facilities. It can also, a lot of times, overlap into technology because it's software, right? DSIM. So you have multiple parts of the data center ecosystem at play here, which means that you have some interesting R&D and product development challenges. You have some potentially interesting staffing challenges. From a business growth perspective, what I'm most interested, though, is when you look at where you've been most successful, how dialed in, how hyper-specific is that ICP, is your ideal client profile? Do you know exactly where the clients are located, how big or small they are, what sizes they are? And then even more important than that, who the stakeholders are that care about all three of these areas. By definition, if you have a single stakeholder that's dialed into design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management, you're either at a very senior level of the company, like a VPC level, or you're at a you're dealing with a relatively small company, because usually the folks that are involved in design are different than ones that are ultimately going to be monitoring energy usage once the facility is commissioned and up and running, and many times also different than the ones that are worrying about the external infrastructure as opposed to monitoring of the incoming energy. The reality, though, is even how we deal with energy and how we deal with infrastructure will vary quite a bit depending on where you are around the world. I was having a conversation with someone a couple hours ago about like how sustainability is looked at outside of the US compared to within the US. Like, for example, in Europe, throughout most of the European Union, there's all kinds of directives that are prioritizing sustainability. And many countries in Asia Pacific, same kind of thing. In the US, it's a lot more concern about power grid availability that's preventing projects from going forward than pure sustainability of issues. And the kind of the direction that this was going and was changed significantly by the change of the administration, by the change of the presidential administration in earlier in the year. But like, yeah, for example, this for sure, how people are looking at design issues, energy monitoring issues, and infrastructure management can vary quite a bit depending on the geographic location, not just where you're located, but where your clients are located. So to grow the business, like, we need to be crystal clear on the personas that matter most. On the design side, it's probably a construction leader or a data center development leader. I often caution people just to be clear that there's a career path called data center development, and there's also a career path called data center business development. Data center development deals with like real estate and site selection and construction and commissioning. Data center business development is part of the go-to-market team. They're dealing with things like lead generation, nurturing, segmenting, CRM, working with account executives, working with marketers, working with the channel organization if you sell indirect as well as direct. So yeah, be crystal clear that there's a difference between data center development and business development. So in terms of growth, yeah, there's development leaders, there can be construction leaders, there can be energy managers, there can be ESG, environmental social governance kind of leaders, there can be infrastructure managers, infrastructure engineers. Again, it's very, very difficult for a small company to do well on more than 2 or 3 buyer personas. If you have more than 2 or 3 buyer personas that you're targeting simultaneously, you better have a decent sized marketing team and a decent sales ops, sales enablement kind of team to be able to do this the right way, so you can segment and really specialize in a way that helps you stand out in the marketplace. The smaller you are, the more you're going to need to pick your battles and get really specific about how you prioritize who the primary segment is and who the secondary segment is in terms of growth. But once you know that, it becomes a lot easier to drill into what's going on in their world, understanding what they're trying to achieve at the intersection of design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management, and what they're struggling with most. And the better job you can do with understanding in their own words what they're trying to achieve individually as a team and as a company, and where they're struggling with most, that gives you essentially what you need for crafting a lot of your go-to-market and sales and marketing strategy. It gives you what you need for website copywriting, product marketing, sales enablement, email marketing, outbound prospecting, social media posts, event strategy. Everything needs to start with not just understanding your business model and what you're trying to achieve, but who the most important segments are that you're trying to engage with early and often. Because in a self-driven journey, where people have become so sales allergic in the early and middle stages of the journey and only want to interact with a member of your company when they're almost ready to buy, the only way that we're earning our way back in now, in a way where we can shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all their options, is we need to shed the vendor labels. We need to not look so much like an AE or an SDR anymore, account executive or sales development rep. We need to look a lot more like a consultant, a teacher, an expert, a trusted advisor. When we do that the right way, we get invited in early and often. And when we invite our prospects and clients to our educational events, they actually want to come to the events because they're learning with us. They're learning valuable skills and methodologies and best practices that can help them, that it can help their team, that can help their company, as opposed to attending an infomercial. No one wants to attend your infomercial. It's okay to have a little bit of self-promotional stuff in there, out of a 60-minute event for 5 minutes, 7 minutes or something like that. But you need to deliver value to get people to be motivated to want to spend a significant amount of time with you. And recognize that this isn't one and done. If there's 25 or 30 touch points that they go through between complete stranger and purchase decision, we need you to have surface area and as many of those as possible. So getting really clear on the 5 or 10 topics that are top of mind for each of your 2 most important segments, and delivering each of those as a monthly in-person event, a monthly webinar, or both, is a really, really powerful strategy for growing that kind of business, regardless of whether these are the stakeholders for design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management. It's possible, if you understand your business model really well, you may find that each of these services, the design, the energy monitoring, and infrastructure management, not only is different people on your team, but it's different people on their team. And it's possible that there's more than one stakeholder on their team for each of those services. Repeat that. So if you have 3 different lines of business, in theory, each of those three lines of businesses can and probably do have both a primary and a secondary stakeholder. So in other words, if you decide the first week of the month, you're going to host a webinar or host a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn on data center design, it's possible that you have architects, data center designers that you're trying to attract. And you may also have data center investors like VCs or private equity or something like that you're also trying to attract. Or maybe there's site planners or something like that, whatever the two most important stakeholders are that you're looking to attract. And to really do that well, you may even want to segment so you end up with 3 different segments, 2 different kind of stakeholders. So you'd have 6 different events. So you're rotating through the cycle every 6 weeks instead of every 4 weeks, right? That's still pretty good if you could get to them 6 times a year as opposed to 12 or something like that. But again, how you decide to segment this up really varies tremendously based on their economic value to you and your existing resources. But just recognize this is not one and done. The more often you can stay in front of them in the context of your most important prospects and clients, seeing your team members as the go-to experts, the better off you're going to be. If you can do this in person, great. If you recognize that a significant percentage of people that should have been in the room that weren't, have your videographer there recording it so they can share it with their coworkers and you can share it with other people who no-showed for your event. If it's not practical for most of your stakeholders to attend because you're either not doing a roadshow or they're not located within a 30 or 60-minute drive, then you need a robust webinar program that supplements all of this, probably with a lot of the same content. But just recognize that you may have 3 different teams, 3 different kinds of individuals that are delivering these services, 3 different kinds of subject matter experts. And on the client side, on the prospect side, that's probably a minimum of 1 kind of stakeholder for each of those 3 segments, probably 2. So when it comes to having a significant amount of surface area, a significant amount of presence that allows you to shape the criteria that your prospects and clients use to decide where they're going to make their big considered purchase decisions on data center design, and data center energy monitoring and data center infrastructure management, the more you can show up in a way that educates and builds trust with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context, the more you're going to stack the decks in your favor with scalable, profitable business growth. The more you're going to differentiate, the more you're going to earn your way in early, the more you're going to motivate those stakeholders to bring more and more of their peers, their coworkers, their boss along with them to these educational events, the more you're proactively driving alignment, getting everyone on the same page in the early and middle parts of the formative stages of that journey, the better off you're going to be. But just recognize that design and energy monitoring and infrastructure management are distinct disciplines. Because of that, they probably each have a separate page on your site. They probably have different team members on your side that sell and deliver these. And because of that, each really needs a granular part of your lead gen, of your education and trust building, of your events and your educational resources to be able to approach this the right way, assuming that the unit economics are strong enough to justify dedicating resources to each if you want to compete and win the biggest, most lucrative clients in your region when it comes to data center design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management. So that's how I would approach how a design, energy monitoring, and infrastructure management company can grow. And that brings us to the final question for this week's data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. So our final question that we'll be addressing today is, how can wholesale data centers manage lengthy sales cycles? How can wholesale data centers manage lengthy sales cycles? So there's 2 basic approaches with this at a high level. So when it comes to wholesale data centers, they're kind of like the first cousin of data center developers because they're largely developing a shell and then they're renting out that empty shell for a long period of time, usually to a single tenant. What a lot of people would consider an anchor tenant. In some cases, they're renting a massive amount of space to one tenant and a small part of that to like retail co-location tenants. And when it comes to that, the fact that I'm using the word tenant as opposed to client probably foreshadows one of the possible directions you can go with this. For wholesale data center providers or data center developers, usually some will choose to engage real estate companies, and it could be the biggest of the big real estate companies like CBRE and JLL and others at that level, or it could be small, independently owned in your local area or somewhere in the middle. So that's play number one, and that's usually a big interest point among people that are looking for large anchor tenants. Play number two is your direct sales team. This is where you're generating your own leads and you're building sales process and you're educating and building trust and nurturing those folks. And when it comes to the direct sales process, as opposed to engaging with real estate agents or engaging with like channel partners, usually the channel partners like managed service providers would be more relevant to retail co-location because their clients are going to take smaller spaces as opposed to taking an entire data center of their own. So more on the direct side or indirect side with your own sales team, it's no different than any kind of data center provider in the space. We're getting dialed into who they are in terms of defining your ideal client profile, where they're located. Typically, when it comes to whether it's wholesale or whether it's retail co-location or something like that, people tend to, the end client or the managed service provider, channel partner, tend to have extreme proximity preferences where they want to know that their data center provider is located in a really, really quick commuting driving distance to be able to get there fast, whether it's from their home, whether from their office or both. I was talking to the CEO of a data center operator a few weeks back, and he mentioned 2 miles. Like, I don't know if it's that extreme, but like this preference for server hugging that you would have thought over time would go away. No, it's just as big of an issue as ever before. So that's the geographic part of it. There's size. Where can you win these deals? Typically, a company that's taking a wholesale space, that's taking a large space, is going to tend to skew significantly larger. Not always the case, but usually. And companies that are taking retail co-location tend to skew a little bit on the smaller side. Again, there's exceptions to all of this, but you'll need to figure out the range for how much space you have available, your cost structure, the amenities that you have, whether you're focused more on selling space or whether you're focused on selling IT services or both. Again, your mileage is going to vary a little bit, quite a bit, depending on that geographic range, depending on how big or small your company is and how big or small their company is. But for sure, consider geographically where these folks are usually going to be located, their sizes, and if there's certain industries where you do better than others. Not as big of a deal with wholesale, more of a bigger deal with like retail co-location. But yeah, there's accreditations and certifications and credentials that come up that you need to have for doing business in certain industries, and you either have them or you don't. If you have them, great. Include that industry in your target account list and your ideal client profile. If you don't, and you're going to be instantly knocked out in healthcare or education or government or something like that, that exclusion should be there prominently as well. So you can make sure your drop-down lists and your filtering and your ads and your outbound and everything take that into account. So you're not wasting resources generating and nurturing leads and potentially wasting time on opportunities where you're just simply not going to be able to close relative to your company's current capabilities and credentialing that you have today. So for the lengthy sales cycles, at the end of the day, if you're managing lengthy sales cycles, or even if you're a broker that are managing lengthy sales cycles, I'm always very partial to email marketing and events. Email marketing and events both allow you to position yourself in a way where you're sharing your expertise with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so they see your company and the individual experts within your company as the go-to experts and you're the go-to gurus, the trusted advisors in your space when it comes to anything and everything having to do with wholesale data centers and technology adoption and digital infrastructure in your particular region. For this particular context, the people that would be most helpful are usually super knowledgeable about real estate prices, about zoning issues, about power grid availability, about fiber that's in the area, tax incentives, what the hiring environment looks like, the competitive environment looks like. They're really, really deep subject matter experts when it comes to anything and everything that goes into conceptualizing and site planning and design and construction and commissioning of that particular facility. And again, depending on whether it's wholesale or retail, how deep they go into that process and how big or small the deal potentially is. But with lengthy sales cycles, it's a matter of getting in early and getting in often. The brokers themselves, it's their job to maintain tons and tons of relationships in the space, so they're always in there early. For building your own team and running this whole process yourself in these lengthy sales cycles, it's a matter of getting really specific on the kinds of companies where you know you can win and retain, where you know you can land and expand, where you know they're super happy, you're super happy, they're profitable, for the quality of the client, the quantity of the client, and both at the account level and at the individual level. And at the individual level, again, if we were talking about colo, you're almost always going to have a direct kind of persona, and you'll almost always have a channel partner persona. For wholesale, again, you can have your own direct full-time sales team that's doing a lot of this, and they certainly would need some marketing support. Or you could potentially have relationships with DCRE, data center real estate folks, and potentially other kinds of channel partners that can bring these huge wholesale data center clients to your doorstep. And again, huge is all relative. It depends on the size of the facility. I think in the near future, we're going to see campuses that rival small cities. We're not quite there yet for that being a common thing that you see all the time, but yeah, for sure it's going to change. The scale of what's needed for AI and high performance computing, and the amount of power and the kind of power that we're talking about with some of the alternative energy sources, especially around small modular nuclear, are going to change the very nature of how campuses are built. In Europe, we're already seeing kind of this movement of the decentralized data center, where it's going back to, instead of these huge facilities in the middle of nowhere, we're seeing smaller facilities that are built adjacent to residential or commercial use. So the excess heat from that can heat the building, drive hot showers, heat the swimming pool, whatever. There's a lot of different use cases for that, depending on the region of the world that you're located in. But in terms of managing lengthy sales cycles, early and often, use email marketing, use email newsletters, teach, share valuable insights that can help them do their job better. And the more time you can get the right prospects and potential clients to spend time with your experts in a virtual, or preferably in this particular context with wholesale data centers, probably in a physical event kind of context. I've talked to people before about even having an event in a tent on the corner of the facility or something like that, or being there for or looking at a restaurant or other spaces where you can host events that are very close to where the facility is going to be if it's under construction. Those all help to stack the decks in your favor with getting a strong know, like, and trust for managing those lengthy sales cycles. It's also incredibly important, the often part. Don't assume that just because you got in there once, that manual follow-up, manual traditional sales follow-up is going to be enough. It's probably not. If your buyers are like most buyers in this space, they're doing tons of research. They're more risk averse than ever. There's more silent decision makers that you don't even know about that are weighing in on all of this. And a lot of this is happening at weird times. Your sales team may be working what they consider traditional business hours, but some of the hidden decision makers on these teams, and some of the visible decision makers on these teams, maybe the only time they can do research is 2:00 in the morning on a holiday weekend or something like that. So the self-driven resources showing up where they're showing up in a way that adds value to their research and decision-making process becomes more important than ever. Typically, wholesale is very closely related to the kind of process of like a hyperscale data center. They're just much bigger deals than retail co-location, and it changes the nature of having a much shorter account-based marketing list, much larger deal sizes, needing a more sophisticated, like basically, for lack of a word, more seasoned, more expensive sales team. But because your unit economics are so high, you can afford to do a lot of things that just are not possible at the other extreme with like SMB, small and medium-sized business retail co-location. So that's how a wholesale data center can manage lengthy sales cycles, is figure out where you can add the most expertise, figure out exactly who the stakeholders are that you care most about engaging with, and figuring out a way to show up early and often in a way that helps them basically learn what they need to do their job better when it comes to all of the research and decision making that goes into finding the right kind of wholesale data center provider for their unique needs around data centers, digital infrastructure, or critical Facilities. So that is the final question that I'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. Again, if you have an idea for a comment or a question or a challenge, for a challenge or a question or a topic that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming show. If you want to stay in the loop about upcoming educational events and resources like this, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up, you can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. If you and I are not yet connected on LinkedIn, feel free to send me a connection invite. Just make sure to mention that you were watching the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be connected with you on LinkedIn. So I'm so glad that you're able to join us next week. We look forward to seeing you back again next week when we'll tackle another handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that companies like yours are facing when it comes to data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. We wish you great success, and we look forward to helping you grow your business and grow your team's impact and grow your individual impact throughout the data center ecosystem. Take care now and enjoy the rest of your day.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.